My neighbor had always been a walking circus of bad ideas, a wannabe YouTube star chasing clout with a series of idiotic stunts. Over the years, I'd witnessed him chug cinnamon until he nearly choked, ride the hood of his car down his driveway, and douse himself in water while yelling epic fail at no one in particular. It was exhausting, like living next to a perpetual blooper reel. So, when he knocked on my door and asked me to collect his mail while he was out of town for a few weeks, I was relieved. For once, peace. Or so I thought. The first few days were uneventful, just the usual junk mail and bills. Then one evening, I came home to find a large cardboard box on his porch, marked with bold red letters, "Return to sender." The box was heavy, unnaturally so. It took all my strength to haul it across the street, and there was no way I was getting it inside my house. Instead, I wrestled with my faulty garage door, its rusty hinges shrieking in protest. In my struggle, the box slipped from my hands and hit the ground with a dull, ominous crack. "Damn it," I muttered, hoping nothing inside had broken. Not that I planned to tell my neighbor if it had. I stashed the box in the corner of the garage and forgot about it, until the smell began. It started faint, like something vaguely off. But by the third day, the stench had grown thick and invasive, clinging to the walls and seeping under the door into my house. It was sickly sweet, with an edge of rot, the kind of smell that worms its way into your lungs and doesn't let go. I thought it might be a dead animal trapped somewhere, but when I opened the garage, the source was unmistakable. The box. Its bottom was sagging, darkened with dampness that left sticky trails on the floor. I told myself it was spoiled meat, maybe one of those subscription boxes gone horribly wrong. But the sheer size and weight of it didn't make sense. How much meat could fit in there? A whole cow? Grimacing, I grabbed scissors and carefully sliced through the tape. The smell hit me like a physical blow, a rancid cocktail of sweat, urine, and decay. I staggered back, gagging, but I couldn't stop now. I pried open the flaps and froze. Inside was not meat. It was my neighbor. His body was contorted, his face locked in a grotesque rictus of fear and pain. He was dead, long dead, but eerily intact, as though the box had preserved him like some macabre time capsule. My hands shook as I called the police. They interrogated me for hours, their questions sharp and relentless. Why was his body in my garage? Why were my fingerprints on the box? It didn't look good, but eventually, the evidence exonerated me. The answer to the mystery was in the dead man's own hands, a vlogging camera. The detectives showed me the footage once, likely against protocol. I wish they hadn't. The video started innocuously enough. My neighbor, grinning ear to ear, sitting inside the box. "This is gonna be epic," he exclaimed to the camera. He had everything he thought he'd need. Water bottles, snacks, a flashlight, even a pillow. His plan? To ship himself across state lines and film the entire journey. The camera captured snippets of his ordeal. At first, he was excited, narrating the vibrations of the truck and the ambient noise of a warehouse. But as the hours dragged on, his tone shifted. He complained about the heat, about the cramped space, about feeling dizzy. Then came the final clip. The box tipped over. The impact was brutal, the sound of his neck snapping unmistakable. The camera's angle skewed, but it kept recording. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, followed by a faint, distant noise that sent chills down my spine. The screech of my garage door opening. I never told the police about that sound. I couldn't. How could I explain it? My neighbor never made it out of that box, and yet someone, or something, had brought him back to me. Now, every time I hear that cursed garage door creak, I wonder if it's just the wind, or if he's still out there waiting. The sauna incident. I was 10 years old, spending spring break at my grandmother's house. My cousin and I were ecstatic to go to the YMCA for the day, a rare chance for freedom and fun. When Grandma dropped us off, she gave us 4 hours to enjoy ourselves. The place was eerily empty. Aside from a few adults in the exercise room, the halls and courts felt cavernous and quiet. We started on the basketball court, passing time with games of tag and shooting hoops. After 2 hours, we grew bored and decided to check out the pool. Despite my dislike for swimming, the inviting stillness of the water convinced me. The pool was completely empty, except for the lifeguard, who lounged disinterestedly at her stand. We swam, raced, and played games until our energy waned. Boredom struck again. That's when we came up with the idea to see who could hold their breath underwater the longest. Standing in the shallow end, we timed ourselves using the clock on the wall. I was winning. On the final round, a sharp tap on my shoulder startled me. I expected it to be my cousin admitting defeat. Instead, it was the lifeguard, her expression cold and stern. "Knock it off," she said, "or I'll have to ask you to leave the pool." Embarrassed, we climbed out, shivering from the chill of the water. She approached us again, this time offering an unexpected suggestion. "Do you want to warm up in the sauna?" The sign on the door said 18 and older, but she unlocked it without hesitation. My cousin and I, thrilled by the rule-breaking gesture, followed her inside. The sauna was small, its walls and benches made of smooth wood. A clock hung above the glass door, and a thermometer in a plastic case was mounted on the wall. She fiddled with the thermometer, turning the knob higher. "I'll leave you two to it," she said, stepping out and closing the door behind her. For a moment, I thought I saw her lock it. The thought was fleeting. Why would she lock us in? The heat was soothing at first, chasing away the cold from the pool. But as the minutes ticked by, the air grew stifling. After 15 minutes, I decided it was time to leave. I turned the knob on the door. It didn't budge. Confused, I jiggled it harder. Still nothing. My cousin tried, her small hands fumbling against the slick metal. We both laughed nervously, assuming the lifeguard would be back any second. But she didn't return. The room grew hotter. Breathing became painful. Every inhale seared my throat. Sweat poured down our faces. I pounded on the glass door, shouting for help. My cousin joined me, our small fists beating against the wood and glass. Through the foggy window, I saw the lifeguard sitting at her stand, staring straight ahead. She didn't move. Panic set in. I shouted louder, my voice cracking. The lifeguard remained eerily still, her gaze fixed on nothing. My cousin slumped to the bench, her towel draped over her head. Her silence terrified me more than anything else. At that moment, I realized something chilling. She wasn't coming back. I don't know how long we sat there, baking alive. The clock on the wall blurred through the haze of heat and tears. My skin burned against the wooden bench, and my head throbbed with dizziness. Then, as my vision started to fade, I saw a man walking toward the sauna. He tapped on the door, gesturing to the lifeguard. She stood slowly, almost reluctantly, and pulled out a key to unlock the door. As soon as it opened, I grabbed my cousin and shoved past the man, desperate for the cool air outside. The lifeguard tried to block our escape, pressing the door shut against my frantic push. The man, bewildered, stepped aside. "I think they want out," he said. She sighed and let go, letting us stumble free. We didn't stop running until we reached the locker room. We dressed in silence, shaken and pale. When Grandma arrived, we didn't dare tell her what happened. To this day, I can't explain why she did it. Was it some cruel misunderstanding? Or did she truly intend to let us die in there? I'll never know, but the memory haunts me. I still can't stand small spaces or the suffocating heat of a sauna.
The plumber. It started with a phone call. It was a regular Tuesday morning when Sarah noticed a slight issue with the plumbing in her old house. She lived in a small, historic neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, in a house that had been passed down through generations. The house had character, some would say too much character. It was old, built in the late 1800s, and the plumbing was, to put it mildly, temperamental. But Sarah had learned to live with it. The problem that morning was simple enough. The water in her bathroom sink wouldn't drain. No matter how many times she fiddled with the faucet or tried to wiggle the drain stopper, the water just stood there, stagnant, slowly rising as if mocking her. She tried a few DIY tricks, but when nothing worked, she picked up the phone. "Hello, this is Greg from Riverside Plumbing," a deep, calm voice answered. "How can I help?" "Hi," she said. "I think I've got a clogged drain. The sink in my bathroom's not draining. Can you send someone over today?" "Of course. I can have someone there within the hour. Don't worry, we'll get it fixed." That was reassuring enough. Sarah didn't think much more of it as she went about her morning routine, waiting for the plumber to arrive. The doorbell rang exactly an hour later. When Sarah opened the door, she was surprised to find the plumber standing there. He looked different than she expected. He wasn't wearing the typical uniform she'd seen from other tradesmen in the past. Instead of a company shirt or a jumpsuit, he was dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. His hair was dark and thick, but the most unsettling feature was his eyes. They were unnaturally wide, the whites almost too prominent, like someone who'd spent too long staring at something in the dark. But the real oddity was how quickly he smiled when he saw her, an unsettling grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi there," he said in the same calm voice from the phone. "Greg, from Riverside. Plumbing." Sarah didn't want to be rude, but there was something off about him. His presence felt intrusive, like he'd already been inside her house 100 times without her knowing. She stepped aside to let him in. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Sarah said, trying to brush away her discomfort. "Not a problem," Greg replied, his eyes scanning the house in a way that felt almost predatory. "I'll take a look at the sink." He walked past her without another word, his footsteps oddly quiet on the old wooden floor. She followed him down the hall, noting how his eyes seemed to linger on certain details, like the old family portraits on the wall or the antique furniture. He didn't seem to be looking at them in a casual way, but rather as if he were assessing them. When they reached the bathroom, Sarah showed him the sink. He didn't ask for any specifics, just crouched down and opened the cabinet beneath the sink. He began inspecting the pipes, turning knobs and adjusting valves with a mechanical efficiency. There was something almost too clinical in his movements, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Sarah stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. It was then she noticed something odd. The pipes under the sink were covered in faint streaks of what looked like dried water stains. But no, they were more like dark smudges, as if someone had wiped them clean, but not quite. They looked almost familiar, like they'd been there a long time, maybe even for decades. "Everything okay?" she asked, breaking the silence. Greg didn't respond immediately. He seemed to hesitate, then finally looked up at her with that unsettling grin. "Everything's fine," he said softly. "It's just an old pipe, you know. Sometimes they need a little more care than you'd expect." He reached into his bag and pulled out a long, thin tool, one that Sarah didn't recognize. It looked almost surgical, like something you'd see in a medical setting. He began working with it, twisting and turning, his face completely focused. Minutes passed. Sarah felt an odd unease creeping in. There was something about the way Greg worked that made her feel watched. She couldn't explain it, but the longer he worked, the more she felt a presence in the room with her. Finally, Greg stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and gave her another one of those strange smiles. "All set," he said. "Everything should be good now." She thanked him, and still feeling a little off, paid him for his services. He left without a word, the same strange expression on his face as when he arrived. He didn't say goodbye, just nodded and walked out. The next few days passed without incident. The sink worked perfectly fine, and Sarah tried to push the odd encounter out of her mind. But then, a week later, she noticed something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The water in her sink started to drain too quickly. It wasn't just that it drained fast. It was as if the water was almost too eager to disappear, swirling down the drain in a violent, almost desperate rush. It was unnerving to watch. She tried to ignore it at first, but each time it happened, the feeling of unease grew. And then, it got worse. The house, which had always felt a little too still, started to feel alive in a way. She'd hear faint sounds at night, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the rooms when she knew she was alone. The creaking of floorboards, the soft shuffling of shoes. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then she noticed something more disturbing. Every time she checked the bathroom sink, the pipe beneath it looked more and more worn. Dark streaks had begun to appear again, but this time they were darker, almost like fresh stains. And one morning, she found something that made her stomach drop. There was a note beneath the sink. It was a small scrap of paper, torn at the edges. It was old, faded, but the handwriting was clear. "I've 6. I've seen it. It's real. Don't let it touch you." Sarah's heart pounded as she stood there, staring at the note, not sure if it had always been there or if it had appeared overnight. She frantically looked around the bathroom, her mind racing. No one had been in there but her. But how could she not have noticed it before? She thought back to Greg, the plumber, and something clicked. She remembered the strange way he smiled, the way his eyes had darted around her house, the way he'd seemed to linger just a little too long. And then it hit her. The stains on the pipes, the tool he used, the way he never said goodbye. It wasn't just plumbing he was interested in. Something had been in her pipes, something that had followed him. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah went online. She typed in everything she could remember about the plumber and his company. She found a few reviews for Riverside Plumbing, most of them positive, but buried at the bottom of the page, there was one strange post. It was from a woman who lived just a few streets over. She spoke about a plumber who had come to her house to fix a similar issue with her sink. She spoke about how the water never stopped draining after that, how it seemed to drain into the walls, into the floors, and how her house never felt quiet again. Then the post ended with one chilling sentence. "Greg is not who he says he is." Sarah never called a plumber again. There's something very wrong with what happened in that house. And if you ever feel an odd discomfort while your sink is being fixed, you might want to check the pipes. Or better yet, just move.